Okay, welcome back to our final edition of the lessons of World War One and all other wars. We're going to do three today, lessons 6, 7, and 8. So let's get right to it. Let me find the screen to share with you. There she is, lesson 6. Don't look at that. Okay, here we go. The lessons of World War One and every other war we have done. Lessons 1 about learning about yourself and how to be a better person. We learned about how your mindset matters. We learned about how leadership matters. We learned about how the average person matters. We learned about the consequences of the average person and the leader's actions and inactions are. So today we're going to talk about how war hurts everyone involved, sometimes in unseen ways. There really isn't anyone who comes out of a war, who's involved in a war, who comes out better. Or comes out good. So I want you to keep that in mind this whole semester, this whole trimester, that war is a horrible thing, and you'll see that. Hopefully, you've already seen that. However, even though how horrible it is, and maybe because it is so horrible, there should be something beneficial that comes out of it, and we're going to talk about how that could happen. We're also going to talk about maybe that war still can be a solution, even though it might be the worst one. That's all today. So let's talk about how war hurts everyone involved, sometimes in unseen ways when it comes to World War One. This is a list of the casualties of World War One, and hopefully they blow your mind. There was about a total of about 9 million people killed in World War One. But I think some of these numbers, as we look deeper into these, are mind-boggling. Like the number of dead here in the Central Powers. You can see that Austria-Hungary had 1.2 million killed, and the Germans had 1.7 million killed, almost 1.8 million killed. And we think about like America in certain wars, even the Civil War, we had about 500 to 600,000 casualties, and we were the only ones fighting on both sides of that war. But here, the Germans lost 1.8 million people. So I think that's just kind of huge to think about. On our side, on the Allied side, the Triple Entente side, you see the Russians were the big losers, 1.7 million killed, and this number is going to be much higher in World War II. But the Russians, even in World War II, lost a lot more than anybody else. The British lost about 1 million. Look back down here with the United States. That I'm not sure if that number is completely accurate. I think it's more around 100,000. But you can just see the number of people killed is just ridiculous, and combined with the number of people wounded, 22 million killed and wounded on one side, 15 million killed and wounded on the other side. So certainly this is a clear way when if you want to try to analyze how war hurts people, certainly the killed and wounded is something to take note of. One thing that's really not on here is civilians as well, and that the breakdown between those who are combatants, soldiers fighting in the war, and sailors and pilots, but also civilians are getting killed. In the 20th century, after World War One, and after World War II mainly, we start to see that every war after World War II, the number of casualties amongst civilians is always much higher than amongst combatants. And so the two world wars are good examples of when combatants are the focus. After that, like everyone's fair game. And when we think about wars that the United States was in after World War II, places like Korea and Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan and Iraq again, the number of casualties amongst civilians far outnumber that of combatants. And so that's something else to think about. You'll see a link to this down below. So if you want to stop this video after I'm done talking about shell shock and watch that when you can, or wait till the end, I don't really care. But this became something known that we called shell shock in World War One. We call battle fatigue in World War II, and we call PTSD today. These are the psychological impacts of war and how it impacts people in unseen ways that we can never tell, and some of these videos of these people are quite shocking. So that's an example of how war can hurt people in unseen ways. And this video too is of the wounded, even those who are wounded, and they come back like this guy you see in this picture. They come back disfigured, especially like their faces disfigured and things. That has a huge impact on them and their lives and on us. If you watch the video, you'll see, and maybe I'll just play it for you right now. I don't know how long it is. It's only 2.5 minutes, but I'll keep talking while it's playing. So these soldiers who were, this is shell shock. Let's get to the wounded soldiers here. So these wounded soldiers, especially their facial problems, they were so grotesque and stuff, and they reminded of all of the people after World War I of the horrible things that war did to people. Yes, so you can watch more about that later on if you want to. But some of the countries in Europe, especially I think in England and France, they would make these masks that would go over these mangled faces. And they said that they made them to help these soldiers, the wounded soldiers, like try to live normal lives. But part of me thinks that it was a way to hide the horrible things that the war did to them. And if you remember the causes of World War I, it had to do with the people, the hatred and the revenge and all of that. And I think people kind of felt guilty about what their support of the war had done to these young men. And so the masks were a way to hide the wounds and hide the guilt that maybe some of these people had. One other way that war hurts everyone is just simply the ugliness. There's this physical ugliness, certainly, of this. We know that World War I was fought between trenches, and you see this is a nice diagram of what trenches looked like. And they had miles and miles and miles of trenches, but here in between the two lines was called no man's land, and you can see a picture of it here and how ugly this is. And if you think about it, there were spaces in Europe like this that no human being stood upright in daylight for years, or else they would be killed. Just another example of the physical ugliness that war causes. I'm hoping no one ever watches a battle and sees this ugliness and thinks that this is a beautiful landscape, because war does not create beautiful landscapes. This is a great letter from Wilfred Owen, who was a British poet who was who fought in World War I, and he wrote these war poems. If you like poems, and you like, how people can use words to say things, I would highly suggest you look at some of the poems of Wilfred Owen. But he tells some crazy stories. He was one of the people that was diagnosed with shell shock and was sent away to try to get better. And it was about this time in the world when we started thinking about and coming up with ways to deal with people who had psychological problems with psychoanalysis and things. Most victims of shell shock were victims of electric shock as well. But people like Wilfred Owen were given these new experimental treatments called psychoanalysis, or the talking cure, where they could talk about their problems. Wilfred Owen was cured, they said, and was sent back to the front line. And he was killed in the last 10 days of World War I. And the British people think this was a huge loss for their culture because of his skill and talent with the English language, and who knows what he could have written after that. I want to talk more about the ugliness, not of this picture, even though the guy in the middle isn't that good looking. But in 2013, I got this grant called the Damaso International Fellowship, and it's funded by these two old ladies, Dee and Dora Damaso, who were teachers in Battle Creek, and they traveled the world, and their families from Italy. And they came up with this plan to send a teacher from Battle Creek on an overseas trip every 2 years. And I was the first one to do it in 2013. Mr. Zimmerman did it in 2015. And there are some teachers from Harper Creek that are doing it as we speak right now. They're in Albania. Anyways, so when they told me about their hometown, not really their hometown, but where their family came from, I decided to go pay them a visit and see what this part of the world looks like. It was up in the Italian Alps. And I took a train up there, and I had no idea where I was staying, or I had no hotel or I had no idea what I was going to see. But I contacted one of their cousins who met me at the train station. He was holding a sign with my name on it, like I was some superstar. And as soon as I got off the train, they took me to this place. And so all the pictures that you're going to see about this place are ones that I took just with my stupid little camera. And so hopefully you can see, like, this is not ugliness. This is like the epitome of beauty. I could not believe what I was looking at when I saw some of these places. Like, here's another picture on top one of the mountains that that they took me to. And again, this is my picture. This is not some fancy photographer who took this. This is just me doing, the stupid 360 panoramic photograph on my phone. Just one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life. But as we got up in the mountains, they showed me these things. These are trenches built by soldiers in World War I because there were battles up here in World War I. They had these mannequins and stuff pretending that they were still fighting the war. And the thing that I couldn't get out of my head was that in such a place of beauty, that there was still all of this ugliness of war being fought. And this is how powerful war can be. And how even if you're immersed in the beauty of what the world can provide to you, you can still be sucked into the ugliness that war provides. This is just a World War I memorial that was built up in one of the mountains. They took us to the top of. This is a monument to American soldiers just in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of Europe. Again, this is one of the pictures that I took, and I love the stormy clouds around it because while it's a beautiful place and it's there for a good reason to memorialize people, it's still, I think, important to think about the reasons why the people were there in the first place, which might be a little confusing. So I came up with this ugliness scale. You'll see this later on in World War II, but I kind of copied it after the tornado scale. And so you see, like, the U1 level up here is when there's very, very little physical damage, no deaths. Damage can be fixed. It looks worse than it is, so maybe just like a little skirmish. But as we get up to like the U6s, this is the most extreme level of ugliness. It says the number of killed may be so big that it's beyond comprehension. The destruction is total. Sometimes so far that you can't really accept how much destruction there is. And so we're going to try to analyze various events in World War II on the ugliness scale. And so you can give it one of these ratings and we can compare things. One of the more ugly battles in World War I was the Battle of Verdun. You'll see it right here. Verdun was a very special city for the French. Like, it meant a lot to them. And the German strategy, the first German strategy was called the Schlieffen Plan, which they were going to take out the British and the French first and then go fight the war in Russia. When that didn't work out, they switched it to a strategy of attrition. Now, attrition in war is a horrible thing. Attrition simply means just keep killing people until they give up. And so the Germans chose the city of Verdun to attack because they knew that the city of Verdun meant so much to the French people that the French government would send as many soldiers as they needed to protect the city. And the more soldiers they sent to Verdun, the more soldiers the Germans could kill. Well, what happened in Verdun was months and months and months of killing on both sides. It was just, and it's a very small place. And so lots of people died. And you can see this photograph of just parts of bodies laying around Verdun. I went to Verdun. I went to this beautiful building. It's called the Bone House, because for years after the Battle of Verdun, and even up to today, this is what, 100 years later, they're still finding bones on the battlefield of Verdun. And where do you put bones from the Battle of Verdun? You put them in the Bone House. When you walk up to one of those windows in the Bone House, you will see this, piles and piles of bones. This is ugliness. And if you look back at how big the Bone House is, this is how huge it is. And in each one of these little windows are piles and piles of bones. Ugly. And finally, there's a video down below about hauntings. There were some people in Europe, when World War I gets over, they really can't accept that their loved ones are dead. And so the rise of like seances of people trying to communicate with the dead go way up. And there's all of these stories about ghosts and the occult of being able to contact the dead, because the living who survived the war and the families of those that were killed couldn't really comprehend what happened and couldn't really come to grips with the deaths of those people. So they didn't. They pretended they were still there. So again, more unseen ways of hurt. Let's go to lesson number 7. And if you remember, lesson 7 is the world should be better after a war. Excuse me. And so to help explain this, I came up with the war box. So the war box is where the war happens. And so all the battles of World War I, the Battle of Ypres and Verdun, and the French and Big Bertha and Belgium and the Schlieffen Plan, and all of that is what happens inside here. This is where the war occurs. There are a lot of these causes of World War I that make all that happen. But the hope is that because of all that happens inside the box, the world is different when it comes out. The problem with World War I is that it ended with the Treaty of Versailles. And as you know already from your previous study of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was not a very good treaty. In fact, it punished the Germans. It limited their army. It made them accept the guilt of the war. It limited their armies. It just mistreated the Germans even after the war. Did it solve any of the issues? Did it solve the alliance system? Did it solve the bad leaders? Did it solve nationalism and militarism and hate? It did none of those things. And so all of these causes that went in to cause the war to happen were the same causes that came out. And so while the war box in lesson 7 says that this world out here should be better than this world out here, it wasn't. And that's why we end up having World War II. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about how while war is probably the worst solution, no, not probably, it is the worst solution to every problem, it can still be a solution. And I want to talk about some things quickly, things like the Civil War, that we know we've had this conflict of American slavery for many, many decades, for decades and centuries that was occurring in the New World. And no one could solve that problem. And we fought the Civil War and we ended slavery. Did we solve racism? Did we fix that problem? Absolutely not. But we did end slavery because of the Civil War. World War II, we'll learn about Hitler and the Japanese and the expansion of totalitarianism and all of these things. So World War II did end all of those things as well. The Holocaust is a different thing. I mean, we did not, as you know, probably we did not fight World War II to stop the Holocaust, but the consequence of ending the German and the Nazi rule was to stop the Holocaust. So maybe that was a good thing. There was the Cold War between Soviet Russia and the United States. between communism and democracy, and the Cold War is over and the Soviets lost. And so maybe that solved something. We have the war on terror right now. Is that something worth fighting? Who knows? But I want you to just think of how war is certainly the worst solution. But if it does change things, if a new, better world comes out of the war box, then maybe we can consider that a solution. And so now we come to the end of the lessons of World War I and every other war. Do the assignment for today. This is all good. We will be moving on to World War II next week and the causes of World War II and how that happened. So be ready for that. But as always, if you have any questions or comments or concerns about anything that we covered in these video lectures, feel free to email me or text me. I look forward to reading all your answers. And have a great weekend if you're watching this on Friday. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.